Over the last several weeks, we have all been washing our hands more frequently and with more attention than in the past. Why do we do it? To protect ourselves and each other from coronavirus. In this installment of Medicine at the Museum, we will examine the history of hand washing through a look at UMA's collection and an interview with UMA's own historian of hygiene, Katie Holohan. Hand washing had been an important religious and hygiene ritual in many places around the world before it finally became standard, accepted practice in Western biomedicine. Katie will tell us the tragic tale of the life and death of a 19th century physician who studied midwives at a maternity clinic in Vienna. Katie is a PhD candidate in German studies at the University of Michigan, where she also has earned a graduate certificate in museum studies and works as an academic education and curatorial assistant at UMA. Today, Katie and I will discuss a painting from the collection of Michigan Medicine. Hi, Katie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being with us today. So, as you know, we are talking about the history of hand washing. I wondered if you could give us a little information about your research, what you're interested in, and how it might relate to the history of hand washing.
Sure. So my project studies the history of hygiene in modern Germany, and I look specifically at a series of public health exhibitions that were immensely popular. Exhibitions aren't visited in these kind of numbers. These were visitors, in the millions, 7.5 million at one of the most famous exhibitions. And these were designed to educate mass publics on the makeup and mechanics of the human body, right? What does the body look like inside? How can you take care of it, right? And these organizers were suggesting methods for rational, quote-unquote, rational nutrition and personal health. So hand washing, of course, included. And so I therein look at the construction of certain body norms, right? What bodies are propped up or proposed as good, healthy bodies, those to be emulated, and then the flip side, which bodies are purported to be unhealthy, diseased, or the hygienic foil.
And who put on these exhibitions?
Yeah, really interestingly, there's a kind of history of German industry involved, and I think we'll see that relates a little bit to the story behind the painting that we're going to look at. But this first exhibition was backed financially by an industrialist, the inventor of mouthwash. Odol is the mouthwash brand in Germany, which you could still buy in stores today.
And where were these exhibitions held?
And they were held in Dresden, which is kind of a second city in the time period. This is the early 20th century, right? So the focus is really on Berlin, and so this is in Dresden in the former east of Germany. And they travel around too.
So they were traveling exhibits. Were they similar to what we would experience today going into maybe a natural history museum or a science museum?
Yeah, actually, I think people often want to make comparisons to the exhibit Body Worlds, if you've ever seen it, with these plasticized bodies, right? The idea being you can really manipulate the body to give it this exhibition value.
And I know that the history of hygiene is something that we kind of take for granted now as being natural, that people have always understood the connection between washing and health, but that's actually not the case necessarily. And so the painting that we've looked at together is by Robert Tom, and it's a part of the History of Medicine collection.
Yeah, so what I really love about this painting is how many subjects are squeezed into this small frame, right? And a lot of these, right, this painting I know is part of a larger series, which is kind of more often than not revolves around a great man, a great scientist. But when I look at this painting, it's not abundantly clear who Semmelweis is, right? So my eye actually goes to this figure in the far back, right, standing in a long suit. But I believe Semmelweis is actually next to this woman holding a mop, right? He's got a towel in his hand and another long black suit.
What can you tell us about him as a historical person?
Yeah, so Semmelweis had a bit of a comeback, right, amid coronavirus, as one of his other monikers is the father of hand washing. So we know that he, in the mid-19th century, was working in a Viennese maternity clinic, and he's he's really trying to get after this disease called puerperal fever, or often called childbed fever.
Right.
A lot of women giving birth are dying of this, and he wants to figure out why. And what's interesting about this Vienna hospital is that there are two wards operating side by side, right? There's one that's run by midwives, all women, and then another ward that's run by physicians and medical students. So he kind of has this, these two case studies at the ready, and he notices that the clinic run by midwives has a much lower rate of death, right? Far fewer women are dying from this puerperal fever. So he sets off to kind of figure out why. Tests a lot of different hypotheses, right? Does it make a difference if the woman's lying on her back or on her side when she's giving birth? And it turns out that he realizes a lot of these med students and physicians are performing autopsies before these deliveries.
Right.
So he postulates maybe that it's these cadaverous particles getting on our hands and our instruments that are infecting these women when we're performing deliveries.
Yeah, my understanding is that these medical students and physicians would literally walk directly from the morgue. Created a lot of infection control problems, but at the time, the cause of disease was understood very differently. So what did he do? What did he institute when he discovered kind of the cause of the problem?
Yeah, so he suggested that the physicians and medical students, after performing autopsies, use a kind of chlorine solution. So not soap and water, but chlorine to clean their hands and their medical instruments before moving from autopsy to delivery.
And I understand that he did this actually in a few locations over time and had good results. But his results were not very well received by the physicians.
Yeah, and I think that's what's also great about the painting is you maybe see some kind of skepticism, right? When we look at Semmelweis holding the towel, right, there are a group of physicians around him that seem to kind of be willingly taking this up and washing their hands, same with the group to the left, whereas this group of four in the back and this man with his hands against the wall seem to be the more skeptical, right?
Yeah. And why do you think they were so skeptical of his solution?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think my understanding is it suddenly shifted the onus of responsibility or blame, right? It wasn't. I know that one theory that they had early on for puerperal fever was women dying in these wards manned by physicians were dying from embarrassment from being seen by male physicians. And suddenly, right, Semmelweis comes along and says it's actually our fault. We haven't been properly, right, disinfecting our hands and our instruments. So suddenly blame shifts.
Yeah, they took it as a direct threat to their professional credibility. Yeah. And I know one of the other causes they would blame was the combustible nature of women's bodies, that we were just sort of prone to falling sick of things and dying. So what was the outcome? So we know that this first round of physicians were not very responsive to his insight that this, introducing the practice of hand washing when you were moving between different units of the hospital could really prevent sickness and death. But ultimately, what happened in the course of his life? Was he ultimately recognized as someone who had contributed a really valuable thing or not?
Well, I mean, my understanding is he's actually kind of this tragic figure in this way, right? He becomes the so-called father of hand washing after his death, and I know he dies in the 60s. He is committed to a sanatorium. I've heard that he died of sepsis, which is kind of an ironic fate.
That is really tragic. Yeah.
And then just years later, Pasteur advocates for, or he introduces his germ theory, right? So in some ways, it's not until that moment he's redeemed, and the timing is just off this, period, and that's just years after Semmelweis' death. So
yeah, and I think that he's this sort of middle figure where causes of disease had been understood so differently. Miasma, this sort of cloud of ill, foul-smelling risk, basically, would have been understood as a cause of disease or sort of an inherent flaw in the nature of women's bodies, would have been something that the physicians were considering, but the idea that it was these small particles that you couldn't see that were causing disease was something that right after his tragic life and death becomes something that is more accepted. Now, can you tell me a little bit about the type of role that you have had at UMA, and if you've had, I know that you've done some research and some work with these paintings, this Robert Tom set.
Yeah, so I've worn many hats, but in terms of this series, Great Moments in Medicine, we were going back through labels and realizing that the labels were actually from the original series, right? This painter Tom worked with a collaborator, George Bender, who worked for Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company, which is a subsidiary of Pfizer. That name might ring bells in light of Corona, right? They've been kind of called to the fore to use their scientific expertise to fight against Corona. So this duo, Bender and Tom, were creating this collection and wrote captions because they had originally conceived of this collection being purchased by pharmacy owners, by hospitals to display in their waiting rooms. And so each one of Tom's paintings came accompanied with a text. And in some ways, I talked about this great man history, right? It was really hagiographic. It was all about Semmelweis, savior of women, but not at all about women and the patient experience.
Right.
So
that or the midwives whose practices he was.
Exactly, right. As the other, right, these two words, you could not have figured this out with, the ward that had a much lower rate of death, right?
That's really fascinating. And you also, I think, mentioned that you went to a museum during your PhD research that was named in his honor. Is that right?
That is, yes. Because Semmelweis has played such an indelible role in the history of hygiene, some of the hygiene exhibitions from Germany traveled to Hungary, specifically to Budapest. There were a lot of physicians and artists in collaboration staging these hygiene exhibitions. So I went to the Semmelweis Museum in Budapest this summer.
Many thanks to Katie for sharing her insights into the history of hand washing before the germ theory of disease had been permanently accepted by the public. Thanks for joining us for this installment of Medicine at the